Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch. Miriam Davenport Eclair had always considered her life with Henri a masterpiece of serendipity. For over 3 decades, their marriage had been a portrait of love, trust, and an unshakable partnership. Miriam, an African-American woman with a sharp wit and a heart that defied her age, was the epitome of grace. Henri, her French-born billionaire husband, embodied old-world charm with his silver-streaked hair and a gaze that seemed to know the secrets of the world. Their sprawling estate outside Geneva was a sanctuary filled with laughter, art, and memories. Yet, a peculiar unease had settled over Miriam in recent months, triggered by a chance discovery. A faded photograph tucked inside an old book in Henri's study. The photograph showed a much younger Henri, standing beside a man she didn't recognize, both wearing military uniforms from the 1960s. Miriam had always known Henri's past as a young man in the French Foreign Legion was shadowy, but this picture bore something more. A handwritten note on the back in elegant script, "For a brighter future. Together, always." The name sign below was illegible, but it wasn't Henri's. That evening, the pair sat in their usual spots in the sunroom, the soft hum of a vintage record player filling the air. Miriam watched Henri, who was engrossed in reading financial reports. The light caught his glasses, highlighting the gentle crinkles around his eyes, lines that told the story of a life well lived. She adored those lines but couldn't shake the image of the photograph. "Henri," she began, her voice steady but probing. "Do you ever think about your time before we met? Those early years?" He looked up, slightly startled. "Of course, my love. But why do you ask?" She hesitated, unsure how to approach the subject. "I found something today while tidying your study. A photograph. From your Legion days." Henri's face shifted subtly, the warmth dimming as if a curtain had fallen over a window. "A photograph? Which one?" Miriam retrieved the photo from her cardigan pocket and handed it to him. His reaction was swift. A fleeting flash of recognition followed by an almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. "It's just an old memory," he said, his voice measured. "Nothing important." But Miriam knew better. Henri's calm demeanor had always been his armor, but she could sense the weight of unspoken words lurking beneath the surface. The days that followed were marked by small but unsettling changes. Henri grew quieter, spending longer hours locked away in his study. Miriam tried to distract herself with her foundation work, organizing charity events for underprivileged youth in Europe and Africa, but her thoughts kept returning to the photograph. One afternoon, while Henri was out meeting a venture capitalist, Miriam decided to delve deeper. She went through the storage room where Henri kept old documents and memorabilia. Among dusty boxes and forgotten keepsakes, she unearthed an envelope labeled in French, "Correspondence, 1964 to 1966. Inside, she found letters written in delicate handwriting, some in French and others in English. They were addressed to Henri from someone named Claude. The tone was intimate, laced with a depth of emotion that Miriam couldn't ignore. Words like, "Dreaming of the day we can finally live without fear," and "Your courage inspires me always," jumped out at her. Miriam's mind raced. Was Claude a comrade? A lover? A confidant? Every question seemed to lead to more confusion, and yet she couldn't bring herself to confront Henri. Not yet. That evening, Miriam prepared one of Henri's favorite meals, a creamy coq au vin, hoping to create a moment where she might gently probe for answers. As they dined, Henri seemed lighter, discussing their upcoming anniversary trip to Provence with genuine enthusiasm. "Miriam," he said suddenly, placing his hand over hers, "you've been quiet these days. Is something troubling you?" She looked into his eyes, those eyes that had held her through countless storms. For a moment, she considered burying her questions, letting the past remain buried. But the words came out anyway. "Henri, I think there's something about your past that you're not telling me," she said, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "Who was Claude?" The room fell silent, save for the faint sound of rain against the windows. Henri's hand slipped away, and he leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and caution. I found letters, Miriam admitted. I wasn't snooping. I needed to understand. Henri closed his eyes, exhaling deeply. Miriam, there are things about my past that I never wanted to burden you with. Claude was an important part of my life, but those days are long gone. Important how? She pressed. Henri, you've always told me that honesty is the cornerstone of our marriage. If this is something that shaped you, I want to know. Henri stood and walked to the window, his silhouette stark against the dim light. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he replied, Claude is the reason I am alive today. But there are things about that time. Secrets that could change everything we've built together. Miriam felt the weight of his words settle over her like a shroud. She had always known Henri to be a man of layers. But this was a depth she hadn't imagined. She reached for his hand, her voice trembling but resolute. Henri, whatever it is, we'll face it together. But I can't bear the thought of you carrying this alone. Henri turned to her, his face lined with emotion. There's more, Miriam. Much more. But are you sure you're ready to hear it? As the rain continued to fall outside, Miriam realized their journey was no longer about unraveling Henri's past but navigating the unknown together. The photograph had been a key, but the door it had opened led to a labyrinth she hadn't anticipated. The days following their conversation were tense yet tender. Miriam gave Henri the space to open up on his own terms, but her curiosity gnawed at her. Henri was a man of action, a builder of empires, and yet the shadow of Claude lingered over him like a specter he couldn't shake. One morning, as Miriam watered the orchids in their solarium, she noticed Henri sitting by the fountain, lost in thought. His posture, usually confident and upright, was slightly slumped. She approached him gently, a tray of tea in hand. You've barely touched your coffee, she said softly, placing the tray on the wrought iron table. Henri looked up, his eyes tired but warm. I've been thinking about what you said, Miriam. About honesty. She sat beside him, her heart pounding. Henri, I never meant to push you. But if there's something I should know, something that weighs on you, I want to share the burden. He reached for her hand, his grip firm yet trembling. There are parts of my life that I've tried to leave behind. Not out of shame, but because they were dangerous. I've always believed in protecting you from those dangers. Henri, Miriam said, her voice steady, after all we've built, after all we've shared, don't you think I deserve to know? Henri nodded, exhaling deeply. You're right. It's time. Later that afternoon, they sat together in Henri's study, the curtains drawn and the fireplace crackling softly. Henri placed a worn leather-bound journal on the desk, its edges frayed with age. This, he began, tapping the journal, is the story of a young man who made mistakes, loved deeply, and betrayed loyalties he didn't fully understand. Miriam waited patiently as Henri opened the journal, revealing pages filled with faded handwriting and yellowing photographs. He pulled out a picture and handed it to her. It showed a younger Henri with the same mysterious man from the first photograph, Claude. They stood in front of an airplane, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning like schoolboys. Claude was more than a friend, Henri began. We met in the French Foreign Legion in Algeria during the war. He was fearless, brilliant, and, in many ways, my opposite. Where I was cautious, he was reckless. But it was his recklessness that saved my life. He paused, his gaze distant. We were ambushed during a reconnaissance mission. Claude disobeyed orders, dragging me to safety when I was shot. I owe him my life. As Henri recounted the events, Miriam saw his demeanor shift. The calm, collected man she knew was replaced by someone more vulnerable, someone haunted by choices made in the heat of war. After the war, Claude and I drifted apart, Henri continued. He wanted to fight for causes he believed in, anti-colonial movements, revolutionaries in Africa and South America. I wanted stability, a life where I could make something of myself. But Claude, he couldn't let go of the fight. Miriam traced the edges of the photograph, her thoughts racing. And the letters? They seemed more personal than just camaraderie. Henri hesitated, his eyes searching hers. Claude and I shared a bond that went beyond friendship. In a time and place where such things were forbidden, we found solace in each other. But it wasn't love in the way you and I know it. It was desperation, a need for connection in the face of constant death. The weight of his confession hung in the air. Miriam placed the photograph back on the desk and reached for Henry's hand. Henri, whatever you shared with Claude, it doesn't change how I feel about you. But there's something else, isn't there? Something you're not saying. Henri closed his eyes, his voice lowering. Claude wasn't just fighting for ideals. He became involved in dangerous circles, arms dealers, intelligence operatives, people who didn't care about human lives. He reached out to me one last time in 1966, asking for help. He was desperate, but I ignored him. I thought distancing myself would keep me safe. And did it? Miriam asked, her voice trembling. For a while, Henri admitted. But last year, I received a letter from a woman claiming to be his daughter. She said Claude had been killed decades ago under mysterious circumstances. She also said that his death might be linked to decisions I made, or failed to make. Miriam's heart skipped a beat. His daughter? Have you spoken to her? Henri shook his head. No, I wasn't ready. The letter included her contact information, but I couldn't bring myself to reach out. Miriam stood, pacing the room. Henri, this is bigger than a ghost from your past. If what she says is true, then there's more to uncover. I know, Henri said quietly. That's why I need your help. If we're going to face this, I can't do it alone. That night, as Miriam lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replayed Henry's revelations. She thought about the secrets they'd unearthed and the ones that still lay hidden. She couldn't shake the feeling that Claude's story wasn't over, that it had somehow bled into their carefully crafted life. Miriam turned to Henri, who was already asleep, his breathing steady. She brushed a hand against his cheek, whispering, "Whatever it takes, we'll face it together." Far away, across an ocean, in a small Parisian apartment, a young woman sat by a window, a stack of faded letters on her lap. She looked out at the city lights, her expression resolute. Tomorrow she would make contact again. This time she wouldn't be ignored. The following morning, Miriam awoke to the sound of Henri on the phone in his study. She lingered at the doorway, his voice muffled but tense. When he emerged, his expression was a mix of apprehension and determination. I contacted her, Henri said simply, referring to Claude's daughter. She's agreed to meet us tomorrow in Paris. Miriam nodded, her heart racing. The prospect of confronting decades-old secrets felt monumental. Yet she knew this meeting could be the key to understanding the weight Henri had been carrying. The flight to Paris was quiet. Henri stared out the window for most of the journey, his hand resting on Miriam's. She squeezed it occasionally, offering silent support. They landed at Charles de Gaulle and checked into a discreet boutique hotel. That evening, they went over the plan. She said her name is Elise, Henri explained as they sat on the balcony, the Eiffel Tower glowing in the distance. She didn't give many details over the phone, but she was insistent that we meet. And what do you expect to learn? Miriam asked gently. Henri sighed. Answers, maybe closure. But I fear the truth will be more complicated than either of us is prepared for. The next day, they met Elise in a quiet cafe tucked away in Montmartre. She was in her late 30s, with sharp features and piercing green eyes that mirrored Henry's. Her curly hair framed her face, and her posture was both confident and guarded. When she spotted them, she stood and extended her hand. Mr. Eclair, Mrs. Davenport Eclair, Elise greeted, her voice steady. Thank you for coming. They sat at a small table near the window. Henri ordered coffee for everyone, though no one touched their cups once they arrived. The tension in the air was palpable. I suppose I should start at the beginning, Elise said, her eyes flicking between them. My mother, Vivian, met Claude in the mid-1960s in Algeria. She was a journalist covering the war, and he was involved in, let's just say, operations that weren't entirely legal. Henry's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. They fell in love, Elise continued, or so my mother believed. But Claude was a man with many secrets. He left her suddenly in 1966, claiming it was for her safety. She never heard from him again. Not long after, she discovered she was pregnant with me. Miriam leaned forward, her voice soft. How did you find out about Henri? When I was in my 20s, I started searching for answers about my father, Elise explained. My mother had passed by then, leaving me with only letters he'd written to her. One of those letters mentioned you, Henri. He spoke of you as a brother and mentioned your role in helping him escape a particularly dangerous situation. Henri nodded, his voice hoarse. I arranged for him to leave Algeria. I thought I was helping him disappear for good. But I didn't realize the full extent of what he was involved in. Elise's expression darkened. Claude's disappearance wasn't voluntary. The people he worked with turned on him. He was killed in 1967 in Morocco, though the official records claim it was an accident. I've spent years uncovering the truth, and every thread seems to lead back to you. Henri sank back in his chair, his face pale. I didn't know, he whispered. I swear. I didn't know they would go after him. Maybe you didn't, Elise said sharply, but your actions set events in motion. Claude trusted you. He counted on you to help him, and yet you left him to fend for himself. Miriam interjected, her tone firm but kind. Elise, what do you want from us? Understanding? Justice? Elise hesitated, her eyes softening as she looked at Miriam. I want to know who my father was. Beyond the letters, beyond the stories my mother told me. And I want to know why he trusted you, even as he wrote about feeling betrayed. Henry's hands trembled as he picked up his coffee cup, but Miriam reached out and steadied him. You owe her the truth, Henri, she said gently. For the next hour, Henri recounted his history with Claude, their camaraderie during the war, their shared ideals, and the tension that grew between them as Claude became more radical. He spoke of the last time they met, in a dimly lit bar in Paris, where Claude begged for his help one last time. I thought cutting ties would save both of us, Henri admitted, his voice breaking. I see now that I was wrong. Elise listened intently, her expression a mixture of anger and sorrow. When Henri finished, she sat back, letting the story sink in. My father may have been flawed, she said, her voice trembling, but he didn't deserve to die like that. Alone, hunted. You were the closest thing he had to family. Henri lowered his gaze, shame etched into his features. If there's anything I can do to make amends. Elise reached into her bag and pulled out a small box. She placed it on the table and slid it toward him. There is one thing. Henri opened the box to reveal a collection of items. A rusted military pin, a dog tag, and a photograph of Claude holding a baby, Elise. Keep these safe, Elise said. They're all I have left of him. As they left the café, Miriam and Henri walked in silence through the cobbled streets of Montmartre. Finally, Miriam spoke. She didn't come to hurt you, Henri. She came for closure. And maybe, in helping her, you'll find some of your own. Henri nodded, his grip on Miriam's hand tightening. I only hope I haven't waited too long to make things right. That night, as they lay in their hotel room, Miriam finally broke the silence. Henri, I need to tell you something. He turned to her, concern flickering in his eyes. What is it? She took a deep breath, her hands trembling. It's about my past. About something I've never told you. Henry's brow furrowed, but he nodded. I'm listening, Miriam. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. The hotel room was quiet, the faint hum of Parisian nightlife filtering through the window. Henri sat on the edge of the bed, his expression calm but intent as he waited for Miriam to speak. She stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the Eiffel Tower shimmering in the distance. I never thought I'd have to tell anyone this, Miriam began, her voice low, almost a whisper, especially not you. But after hearing everything about Claude and Elise, I realized that secrets have a way of eating at you. Henri leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. Miriam, you've been my anchor, my reason to believe in redemption. Whatever it is, it doesn't change who you are to me. She turned to face him, her eyes glistening with tears. Henri, my name isn't even Miriam. It's Marion Brooks. And 60 years ago, I was part of something I've tried to forget. Henry's brows knit in confusion, but he didn't interrupt. Miriam pulled a small, weathered photograph from her purse and handed it to him. It showed a young woman, Miriam herself, standing beside a group of civil rights activists. They were outside a courthouse, holding signs demanding justice for a man falsely accused of murder. "I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1943, she said, her voice steady now. My family was deeply involved in the civil rights movement. My father was a pastor, and our church was a hub for organizing protests, rallies, anything to challenge segregation." Henri studied the photograph, the image of his wife as a young woman both familiar and startling. "You never spoke much about your childhood," he said softly. "I thought it was because of the pain of losing your parents." She nodded. "That was part of it. But there's more. By the time I was 20, I was deeply involved in the movement. I worked with a group that helped organize voter registration drives. One summer, we uncovered evidence that a local politician had ties to a series of violent attacks on black families. We planned to expose him." She paused, her hands trembling. Henri reached out, but she stepped back, shaking her head. That politician wasn't just some local bigot. He was powerful, connected to men who would stop at nothing to silence us. One night they came for us. There was a fire at the safe house where we kept our files. I barely escaped with my life. Henry's face darkened. "Miriam, I ran," she continued, her voice breaking. "I left Birmingham and changed my name. I thought if I disappeared, they'd forget about me. For years, I lived in fear, moving from city to city, never staying long enough to make connections. I abandoned everything, the movement, my family's legacy, because I was too scared to fight anymore." Henri stood, crossing the room to take her hands in his. "You were protecting yourself, Miriam. You were just a girl." Her tears spilled over as she shook her head. "But I didn't just abandon the movement. I abandoned someone. Someone who counted on me." Henry's expression shifted from concern to confusion. "Who?" Miriam pulled another photograph from her purse, this one of a young boy, no older than 5, standing in front of a modest house. "His name was Daniel, my younger brother. When our parents were killed in a church bombing, I became his guardian. But when I fled, I left him behind." Henry's eyes widened. "Miriam, I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice breaking. "I sent him to live with our aunt in Chicago, where I thought he'd be safe. But I didn't stay. I never even checked on him. And when I finally tried to find him years later, he was gone." She sank onto the edge of the bed, burying her face in her hands. "I don't even know if he's alive, Henri. I failed him. I failed everyone." Henri knelt beside her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "Miriam, you've spent your life helping others, building foundations, fighting for justice. You didn't fail. You survived. And that takes courage." She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "But what if Daniel didn't? What if he grew up thinking I didn't care?" Henry's expression softened. "Then we'll find him. Together. You gave Elise the chance to know her father. Now it's time you gave yourself the chance to find your brother." Miriam clung to him, the weight of decades lifting slightly as Henri held her. For the first time in years, she felt the flicker of hope. That evening, as they lay in bed, Henri spoke softly into the darkness. "You've always believed in me, Miriam, even when I couldn't believe in myself. Let me return the favor. We'll find Daniel, and we'll face whatever truths come with it." Miriam nodded, her voice barely audible. "Thank you, Henri." Far away, across the Atlantic, a man in a small Chicago apartment held a faded photograph of a young woman. His sister. He stared at it, wondering if she ever thought of him, if she even remembered the promises she made. Tomorrow, he decided he would make the call. It was time. The phone call came just before dawn, the sound breaking the fragile silence of their Paris hotel room. Miriam sat up, her pulse quickening as she reached for the phone. Henri, alert as ever, placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "Hello." Miriam's voice wavered as she spoke. "Is this Marion Brooks?" A deep, hesitant voice asked on the other end. Miriam froze. The sound of her old name felt foreign, as though it belonged to a ghost. Henri leaned in closer, his eyes filled with concern. "Yes," she said after a long pause. "Who's calling?" "It's Daniel," the man replied. "Your brother?" Miriam gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Henri quickly steadied her as she fought to find her words. "Daniel? Oh my God! It's you?" "It's me," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been trying to track you down for years. I didn't know if you were even alive." Tears streamed down Miriam's face as she gripped the phone tighter. "I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting you. I thought sending you to Aunt Claire was the right thing to do." Daniel's voice softened. "I know you meant well, Marianne, but it was hard. Claire did her best, but I spent my childhood wondering why you didn't come back. I was so scared," Miriam admitted, her voice trembling. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to make it right. But I'm ready to try now, Daniel. Please tell me where you are. I want to see you." "I'm in Chicago," Daniel replied. "I'll text you my address. Come whenever you're ready." The next morning, Miriam and Henri boarded a flight to Chicago. The tension between them was different now, less of the oppressive weight of secrecy and more of the anxious energy of reunion. As they descended into O'Hare International Airport, Miriam looked out the window, the city's skyline emerging through the clouds. Her heart ached with anticipation and dread. Would Daniel be angry? Would he even recognize her? Henri placed his hand over hers, grounding her. "No matter what happens, you're not alone in this." Miriam nodded, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. They arrived at Daniel's apartment, a modest brick building in the south side. Miriam clutched Henry's arm as they climbed the steps, her legs trembling. When they reached the door, she hesitated before knocking. Seconds felt like hours before the door opened, revealing a man in his early 60s. His salt and pepper hair and weathered features were eerily familiar, echoes of their father in his strong jaw and piercing eyes. "Marianne," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel," she breathed, tears already forming. Without another word, he pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly as if afraid she might vanish again. For a moment, the years of separation melted away, leaving only the unbreakable bond of family. Inside, the apartment was warm and inviting, filled with photographs of Daniel's life. Miriam's eyes darted from one image to another, pictures of him as a young man with friends and with a family of his own. "You have children?" Miriam asked, her voice tinged with awe. Daniel smiled. "2 daughters. They're grown now, but they're the light of my life. I wanted to give them everything we didn't have." Miriam reached for a photograph of 2 women, their radiant smiles lighting up the frame. "They're beautiful." Daniel's expression grew serious. "I've told them about you. They've always wanted to meet their aunt." As they shared stories, laughter mingled with tears. Miriam recounted their childhood in Birmingham, the courage of their parents, and the harrowing day she decided to flee. Daniel spoke of his life in Chicago, the challenges of growing up without her, and the triumphs that had shaped him into the man he was. Henri listened quietly, offering words of encouragement and admiration when needed. He saw the pain in Miriam's eyes, but also the healing that was beginning to take root. The evening ended with a bittersweet goodbye. "You're not leaving forever this time, right?" Daniel asked as he hugged her tightly at the door. Miriam smiled through her tears. "Never again. Promise." As they walked back to the car, Miriam turned to Henri. "I feel like I've been given a second chance to rebuild what I thought was lost forever." Henri nodded. "You've shown me the power of confronting the past, Miriam. You've helped me see that the truth, no matter how painful, can set us free." Weeks later, back in Geneva, Miriam and Henri received a letter from Elise. It was a photograph of her and Daniel, smiling together during a lunch in Chicago. Beneath it was a simple note. "Thank you for giving me the courage to seek out my family. Claude may be gone, but through you, I found a connection I never thought possible." As Miriam read the letter, Henri placed an arm around her. "We've been through so much, but look at what's come of it. A family reunited, old wounds beginning to heal, Miriam smiled, leaning into him. And through it all, you've been my rock, my constant. Henri kissed her temple. And you've been my compass, Miriam, always leading me home. Together, they sat on the terrace, the sun setting over the Swiss Alps, knowing that while the past had shaped them, the future was theirs to write.